Hello, physics geniuses. This is Ryan. I am publishing your first video lecture. Um, we're on chapter 23. I left off on slide number 19. It's going to be about page 10 in your notes. And we're talking about capacitors. I do want to let you know that the way that I'll be doing video lectures on my YouTube channel is for you to first access the lecture portion of the materials that is just PowerPoint slides. Then you will have a separate video where I will do examples within the PowerPoint slides. I'm separating those two. I'm going to do example problems separately. So that's a little clunky. I think that this might be the easiest way to go for this. I'm going to experiment a little bit, I believe, with the document camera and see if I can do my examples on the document camera. Or if that doesn't work, then we'll just use the whiteboard in my laboratory. But we will do the examples. I hope you're all getting through this well. I know this is really, really inconvenient and a little demoralizing to finish up the semester this way, but I do want to make this as easy as possible. So this first video lecture, then I will be doing these slides to finish up chapter 23, and then there will be a second video lecture that I will do the examples for chapter 23. I will be holding regular office hours. You can reach me by Skype at drhooker, or you can reach me by phone. My desk phone is 530-226-4734. Okay, so we talked about combinations of resistors. And combinations of resistors in series, the resistance is additive. In combination resistors in parallel, the resistance, the inverse of the resistance is additive. And so that is just a extension of Kirchhoff's law and Ohm's law. So you can use those two in order to find the total resistance. We did some calculations and some examples on finding the equivalent resistance with circuits, and I went through that the last time we met in person. Now we're doing capacitor combinations. So it turns out that parallel capacitors have to have the same voltage drop. You have to, whenever you have a branch here, the voltage drop here has to equal the voltage drop here. And so what that means is that the charge that accumulates on the first capacitor is just equal to the voltage drop times the capacitance. The charge in the second capacitor is the voltage drop times the capacitance for that parallel one. Okay, so because of that, then our charges are additive, and our equivalent capacitance, if we just had one big capacitor that did the same thing, would just be the capacitance of each one of these parallel capacitors. So when capacitors are in parallel, then we add them together. Okay, each one has the same voltage drop, so they're additive. Okay, now when we have serial capacitors, instead of having the same voltage drop, they have the same Q. Okay, so Q1 or Q plus here, the charge plate that's a positive charge, is equal to Q plus down here. Q minus on the charge plate here is equal to Q minus down here. And the voltage drop is not the same. The voltage drop, you have one voltage drop for the first capacitor and one voltage drop for the second capacitor. The sum of those two equals the electromotive force that you have in the battery. Okay, so that's how that works. So because of that, in series capacitors, the equivalent capacitance is the inverse. Okay, so you add up the inverse of each capacitance and then take the inverse of that, and that gives you the equivalent capacitance. Okay, so here's a conceptual problem. If we have all these combinations of capacitors, which one has the highest capacitance? So you have one capacitor, you have two capacitors in parallel, okay, and we're assuming that each one of these capacitors is additive, or I'm sorry, is equivalent. So if you had two capacitors in series, then you would just add them up, okay, and then you have two in parallel, excuse me, you would add them up, and then if you have two capacitors in series, then you take the inverse of the capacitance. So, and then finally, you have one in series and two in parallel. So these two you would add, and this one you would take the reciprocal of them. So with these three capacitors, so you get two that are additive, and then you get one that is reciprocal. And when you do that, capacitors in series actually reduce the total capacitance. Capacitors in parallel actually add to the capacitance. So once you have, the only place that you're adding to capacitance is B. Okay, so if this was say 5 farads, and this was 5 farads each, that would be 10. If this was 5 farads and 5 farads, that would be 2.5, and it turns out this one is 3.33. Okay, you can check those calculations if you like. I just did those very quickly, but B would be the answer. And if you don't understand this, just put capacitors, put 5 farads on each one of them and use the previous equations to calculate the equivalent capacitance. Okay, now, whenever you have a circuit that is charged up, then that will charge up the capacitor. Then in order to discharge it and to protect the circuit, you need a resistor in it as well. So this is what's called an RC circuit. An RC circuit has a single capacitor that is charged up, and then you have a resistor that is in the flow, in a serial flow with the capacitor. And what happens is as soon as you close the switch up here, then you start out with an initial current and you have an initial voltage across the resistor. And then over time, as this capacitor loses charge, okay, it's not a battery, it doesn't generate charge, but it has been charged up. But over time, this will show an exponential decay of both voltage and current. Okay, so the exponential decay looks something like this. So your current at any time t is just E, that's the exponential function, to the t divided by the resistance and the capacitance multiplied together times the initial current. Your voltage across the capacitor is equal to the voltage initially times e to the power negative time divided by resistance times capacitance. Okay, so when you do this, you see that your current at time 0 starts at the highest level possible. You're just following Ohm's law. And then as soon as you close the switch, as soon as you close the switch, you get an initial current, and then it decays very rapidly over time. Okay, voltage does the same thing. As soon as you close the switch, the voltage across the resistor then and the voltage at the capacitor have to be equal and opposite. And then as the resistor will burn off current, this could be something like a flash on your camera that has a small resistor on it, and it will just burst very, very quickly. And then the voltage then decays very, very quickly afterwards. Okay, so if we have this, if we have an RC circuit like this, then we know that the rate of decay is going to be related, inversely related in the exponent to the resistance, and inversely related in the exponent to the capacitance. This is one that I'm going to do. Let's say they were charged up at 5 volts. I'm going to do this with the document camera in a separate video. And so hold on to your seats for this one, and we'll get back to this one. Okay, so we're going to talk about electricity in the nervous system. This is really, really good for biologists. Here we have some nerve cells. Okay, these are neurons. Neurons have axons, and they also have cell bodies. And the axons then stimulate electrical potential, so they carry current. Okay. And so here's the interior of a neuron. Here's the cell membrane of the neuron. Okay. And a pump actually moves sodium out of the cell. Okay, so sodium leaves the cell, potassium comes into the cell. So the sodium concentration outside the cell is higher, and the potassium concentration inside the cell is higher. When a sodium channel opens up, then sodium this is a channel, so it's just a tube. So sodium flows in, potassium flows out, and this flux of ions then causes an electrical stimulus. Okay, so inside the cell and outside the cell there is zero field, but on the surface there is a net charge because of this flow. Okay, so you have a net electrical potential. And so because you have this net electrical potential, then the potential inside the cell is, at this point, is negative, and outside the cell is positive. And so the potential inside the cell is negative 70 millivolts. Okay. The cell membrane actually acts as a resistor. Okay, so if we just were to flatten this out, you know, we have one end of the resistor, we have the other end of the resistor, and we can just say that this is the cross-sectional area of a cell. Okay, it's just the surface area of the membrane, and the length of the resistor is the thickness of the membrane. Okay, and so as sodium is flowing into the sodium channels, that creates a positive charge. Okay, more sodium ions coming in, that's positive. So the electrical potential goes up. Then as the cell repolarizes, potassium flows out, the electrical potential goes down, and then it reestablishes a resting potential. So it goes down below the resting potential. Okay, it overshoots its initial value, and then it establishes equilibrium. Okay, so the action potential, this whole thing is what's called the action potential. It starts at negative 70 millivolts, it goes up to positive 40, then goes back down, below negative 70, and then equilibrates again, and this time is less than 1 millisecond. This action potential then depolarizes, repolarizes, and then goes back to equilibrium in this whole time. Okay, so ion channels are triggered and they develop an action potential in this cell here, and the ions flow down the axons, okay, to the next segment. In between the segments we call nodes. And once the potential reaches the threshold value, the action potential is triggered at the next node, then it goes to the next node, and it goes to the next node. So you have current here first by one action potential, second by the next action potential, third by the next action potential, and each one of these axons then, or each one of these nodes then conducts the electricity in that particular fashion. Okay. So if we look at an axon that's myelinated, this looks like a little RC circuit. Okay. So here's our battery with a switch on it. When that switch is closed, that will charge up the insulating membrane. I'm sorry, the fluid between the insulating membrane is a little capacitor. Okay, so that will charge that up, closing the switch of the battery. And when we close the switch, an action potential is generated here. This will charge up the conducting fluid. And then this switch closes here. That causes an action potential there. When the voltage exceeds a trigger voltage, okay, in the capacitor, then that will trigger this next node to close, this switch to close here. That will then cause this capacitor to charge up. That's an action potential here. And then this will charge up over time. And then until this threshold value is exceeded, it will get that switch. So it just works its way down. Okay. So once this triggers here in each particular switch, then you see the action potential move down the axon. Okay. So let's look at an example that we'll just talk through really quick. There are some diseases that result in a thinning of the myelin sheath that surrounds peripheral neurons. Okay. And the myelin sheath then carries signals between the spinal cord and the limbs. And then how will this thinning affect the nerve conduction speed? Okay. So we want to explain this using the model for nerve conduction developed in this chapter. Well, what you do is you go back to the decay equation for conducting electricity in an RC circuit, a resistance capacitance circuit, and the decay of the decay in terms of the action potential will cause the response to attenuate much, much more quickly. Okay. Okay, so I looked at this example problem again, and it turns out that this, going back to this previous figure, this is not right here anymore an adequate representation of signal propagation in a myelinated neural axon. And I have an update in the new edition of my book. I'm going to show you that actually. I'm going to do my next video as webcam and doccam, and I can show you that directly on the doccam how that works. And so let me go ahead and disregard this slide. I don't like it. Disregard this slide. I will explain that based on the new model of an axon that I'm going to show in just a minute, and then we'll do this example in our problem-solving portion of this video lecture. So this first video lecture is just the PowerPoint slides. The next video lecture is the problems in the PowerPoint slides. I'm going to solve those by hand using the document camera. So I'm going to conclude this video lecture. It's only about 20 minutes. And then you'll have a next video lecture that shows the actual problem solving.